Hi, welcome to 3.4 Influences on Business Decisions. This unit goes really well with 3.1, and in fact, actually, some teachers might teach 3.1.1 as kind of an introduction to Theme 3 and then teach all of 3.4. So there's quite a lot of link and throwback to the 3.1 unit. However, for the interest of keeping these videos in the same way they've been done all the way through, I'm going to just stick to this unit on this time. So we've got corporate influences, corporate culture, stakeholders and shareholders, and then business ethics. So corporate influences, this is just, anything that influences a business's decision making or their objectives. And this is why this links really nicely, because 311 is corporate objectives. And so these influences will influence those objectives. The word corporate just kind of means businesses as a whole. And so we're thinking, broadly here, that we're thinking about the business as a whole kind of entity. So these are the kind of things that might influence businesses and their decisions and the decisions that they make and their objectives. The first is thinking short-term versus thinking long-term. Now, I'm going to stereotype a little bit here because this is not essentially true for every business, but what we quite often see is the businesses that are focused short-term are the businesses that are focused on profit. And so their objective will be to make profits in the short term, and that could be because they're a PLC and they're driven by pressure from shareholders. It could be for a variety of reasons, and there's not necessarily anything wrong with this if that's what your business is seeking to do, but it will influence the decisions you make. It will influence the aims that you set, the objectives you set. We do have other businesses, though, that think a little bit more long-term. So these could be focusing on growth or sustainable growth. And I know one of the areas I study with my students is looking at German companies, certainly the kind of middle-sized businesses that focus on being world-class. There's a huge focus on innovation. There's a huge focus on growth. But it's not about making a huge profit. It's about making yourself the world leader in a particular area. So we've got short-term versus long-term thinking, and then just understanding how that will influence the decisions a business makes. We also have, when we think about how we make our decisions, some businesses will be very evidence-based and others will be quite subjective-based in terms of their decision-making. So what does that mean? Well, evidence-based is where you will base your information around data and trends. And so quite a lot of businesses will use this to determine, for example, staffing rotas. You will look at data from maybe the previous week, the previous year, the same weekend, the previous year, and trends to identify, okay, well, usually we get this many customers, so we are going to need this many members of staff at these times. It could be based around market research. Sometimes you'll just make subjective decisions, and these are going to be based around kind of a hunch or a feeling. And I guess the key thing is there's a place for both. Sometimes data can't tell you everything. So for example, if you are looking to recruit a new employee and you've got two in front of you and one's got 12 years of experience, the other one's fresh out of university, in terms of data, you're going to have to go with the one with the experience because they've got data behind them. But when you interview them, you get a feel for personality, you get an idea about what you think someone might be capable of. You might have a hunch or a feeling that the younger, less experienced member of staff, you might get the feeling that they could become better than the more experienced one, maybe in the long term. And so sometimes you can't judge everything by experience or by data. Sometimes you have to judge it by that feeling, and so that might influence your decisions as well. In a perfect world, you'd have a mix of both. You'd use both in the appropriate situations. The next topic is corporate culture. Well, what is corporate culture? Corporate culture is the way a business behaves, the actions and the behaviors that underpin all of the business's decision making. And so culture can be a really positive thing. If there's a good culture, it can really drive an organization and help an organization to succeed. But it can also be quite a barrier as well if you've got a negative corporate culture. So we can classify these into 4 different types of culture. These were Charles Handy's cultures. There's power culture, role culture, task culture, and person culture. And we'll just briefly go through what these 4 mean. But the main part of this is to understanding the concept of culture and what a good culture and a negative culture looks like. And we'll talk about that in a second. So power culture. This is where power in the organization is going to be held by just a few organizations. They have the influence, they have the decision making. And this is fine in some organizations. Decisions can be made really quickly, can be made really effectively, especially if the people who have got the power are very good at their jobs. So that might be an organization that has a power culture where there's kind of 1 or 2 or 3, maybe a small group of people who are in charge. A role culture is more like the organizational hierarchies we looked at in organizational structures in 1.4.3. This is where there are clear rules for everyone. Everyone knows their role. Everyone knows their responsibilities. And so, within our school, I have certain responsibilities based around my job. Others have other responsibilities based around theirs. And so the culture, the power, the decision making, the way people behave, the way people lead is based around the roles and responsibilities that people have. A task culture is where we would form a team to complete a specific task or a particular project. Typically, these have a bit more of a matrix structure, and power can shift depending on whose expertise is needed at certain points. So if you've got a group of employees working together from different backgrounds, you might rely on one for certain parts and others for other parts. And so with a task culture, that's typically the scenario in which that you would see that. And then the last one is a person culture, and this is where the person themselves is perceived to be bigger than the organization. This is quite often, you'll see this in groups of professionals that kind of come together to start an organization. So for example, a group of lawyers or a group of dentists or something like that, where if you don't go to visit the organization, you go to visit the individual. So for example, I see an osteopath every couple of months. When I'm not going to see his organization, I'm going to see him, and his kind of treatment for his customers is more important culture-wise than the organization, I suppose. Whereas other customers may go to different osteopaths, they might kind of feel the same about theirs. So you'd quite often see that in those organizations where the person kind of maybe works maybe quite alone with maybe support staff. You might see a person culture. But the key thing here is how do you form a culture? Well, leadership's going to play a big part. The leader is usually the most important factor in determining a culture. If you look at any of the big sports documentaries, whether you're a sports fan or not, like something like the All or Nothing series with a lot of the football managers and sports managers in NFL and what have you, you can see how the culture is formed by the leadership and how they determine what culture they want, and they try to put that in place. If you've seen the TV show Ted Lasso, that TV show is basically about culture. It's about establishing a culture within a fictional football team to hopefully have a positive impact. You can't just say, though, you're going to have a certain culture and then that's going to be the case. It has to be consistently exemplified. If you have a leader of an organization that says, this is the culture we want a culture where everyone's opinions are valued, we want a culture where everyone works hard, everyone feels like they can grow, but the actions of the organization don't match that, the culture is going to fall flat on its face. Culture exists within businesses, culture exists within classrooms. I try to have a certain culture in my classrooms where students, can be relaxed and not under too much pressure, but also understand that they need to work hard and expectations are high. And so I try to do that anyway. How well it works is not really for me to judge. But that's kind of the culture I want to have, where students have a good relationship with me, have a good relationship with each other, enjoy the lessons and feel like they're learning, And that is only going to work if I'm consistent in how I apply that. If I say I want a certain culture and then I don't apply the necessary things to make that happen, then the words that I've said are worthless. The second part to bear in mind here is we do have difficulties when we try and change cultures. And this could be for a variety of different reasons. Quite often when a new leader comes in, or if the business hasn't performed very well, think about 3.6.1 from the 3.6 video here, we might decide we want to change our culture. We will get quite a bit of resistance here. We've got to understand we'll get a bit of resistance here, especially from long tenured staff or staff who potentially, benefit from the current culture. So it's just worth bearing in mind that it can actually be really quite difficult to change a culture, especially if an organization has been used to working in a certain way for a long period of time. Speaking of people who might be resistant to changes in culture, we can now start to focus on our stakeholders versus our shareholders. So first, we know the difference between the two, but we're going to do that by introducing who our stakeholders are. So let's have a look at these. We're going to group them into two categories. We're going to have a look at internal on our left and external on our right. So we'll start with the internal ones, and we can introduce what a shareholder is as we go through these. The first is our majority shareholders. So our internal stakeholders, I guess I should start with stakeholders. Stakeholders are any organization or individual or person or group of people who have an interest in the decision making of a business, have an interest in what a business does. The internal ones are involved in the day-to-day running of the organization. The external ones aren't necessarily involved in the day-to-day. They might be involved every so often. And with some of these, we could argue they're involved day-to-day, but not an individual, if that makes sense. I'll get to that when I get to like customers, etc. Our majority shareholders are very much involved in the day-to-day. That doesn't necessarily mean they'll make decisions every day. You do have majority shareholders who are quite hands-off, but for the most part, the majority shareholders, the ones who have control over an organization, will be involved in big decisions. We have our employees. Of course, they're involved every day. They're at work. And I guess just to sort of specify the different levels of employees, we might have managers or directors who might have more say in the day-to-day responsibilities and decisions of a business than the employees who are maybe on a lower level. Our external ones, we've got more of these. We've got minority shareholders. So these might have an interest, but they might not actually be involved in the day-to-day. They might just be silent investors who have invested some money and are hoping for a return. Customers, of course. And I get it, like a business is going to interact with its customers every day, but customers aren't involved in the business decision making on a daily basis. An individual customer will attend a business maybe once a week, maybe once every few days, depending on the business, maybe once a year. So customers are external. Lenders, so people who've lent a business money, banks, etc., could be a range of sources of finance, could be external stakeholders. Competitors are, of course, interested in what a business does, both in terms of trying to be better, but also just, being aware of what your competitors are up to. Suppliers are really interested. They want to know, if your business is growing, are they going to get more supplies? Are they going to get more opportunities? Government is interested because they're going to receive tax, but also they want the business to create jobs. And so as a result, they have a real interest in what the business is doing and that the business is successful. And then lastly, society, local communities. And there are more than this, by the way. We could go into more detail on here, but this is just a recap. So society could be the local community. It could be society at large. They're going to be impacted by decisions businesses make, especially if there's, for example, expansion that creates jobs in the area or potentially creates pollution in the area. There's so many different ways society could be impacted. When it comes to our stakeholders, I guess the key thing to understand here is, first of all, who our stakeholders and our shareholders are, but that there is going to be a conflict between these. And when we make a decision as a business, we have to understand that that decision might not necessarily be popular with every single one of our stakeholders. And in fact, actually, that's very unlikely. So, for example, if a shareholder decides that they need to make more profit, and so they make a decision to increase prices or to do something different about the organization, customers may be unhappy with that. If an employee wants a pay rise, but the majority shareholders want to maintain their profit levels and maybe feel like they can't afford to give the pay rise, then you've got a conflict between employees and shareholders. There are so many different areas where you can see conflicts here. So starting to think about how these stakeholders might conflict with each other is really, really important. The last, and to be fair, this next topic is a perfect example of when you might see conflict between stakeholders, this concept of ethics. So ethics, it comes down to this big trade-off. Most ethical decisions cost money, and the fact that these decisions cost money impacts on profits. So there's almost a trade-off between ethics and profit. And in that, the more ethical you are, the less profitable you might be. It doesn't always work like that. Sometimes being ethical can be a unique selling point, which can lead to you becoming more profitable. But generally speaking, the increased cost of being ethical can have an impact. So let's have a look at some examples of ethical decisions. We've got treating your employees well, taking care of the environment, being honest and transparent in your dealings. That could be through publishing accurate financial information and what have you. Being fair with your competitors, treating your suppliers well, recruiting fairly, no discrimination, making sure that staff are kind of given the right kind of opportunities and what have you, and just also treating your customers with respect. And there's far more to it than this, and you could be more specific with the examples, but hopefully it gives you an idea of what is ethics. Ethics is doing the right thing. We have a level of ethics that is, I guess, needed by legislation. So, for example, fair recruitment. Well, there is fair recruitment legislation. That means that businesses have to be ethical to a degree, because if they don't, they're breaking the law. But there is a level where we can go above and beyond that, and that is what we call corporate social responsibility. Corporate social responsibility is where we go above and beyond the legal requirements in terms of ethical behaviors. So this is where businesses do more than is just what legally required. They're doing it because they believe it's the right thing, or if we're being cynical, they believe it's what's going to generate positive reputation. And that's the big thing with this ethics stuff, is it is going to be good for your reputation. It is going to be good for your brand name. Some businesses will set their entire company's image up based around them being corporate social responsibility focused businesses. One thing that's worth bearing in mind here is if a business is doing corporate social responsibility, you'll be able to find out about it on their website. because they're not going to keep that stuff quiet. They're not going to do that in the background. If they're doing things that are good for all of these different stakeholders, they're going to share it. So hopefully that's helped with 3.4. Again, have a look at the resources available in the description. Have a look at the other videos on this channel. There's all of theme 1, 2, 3, and 4 up there now to have a look at. So plenty to get your teeth into. If you've got any questions, let me know in the comments.